name is Nathaniel Cross, and I am a trained forest ranger stationed in the state of Washington. For more than a decade, my profession has placed me in the deep wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, patrolling thousands of acres of forest, mountain ridges, river valleys, and stretches of ancient trees that tower higher than church steeples. I entered this career with a profound respect for the land, believing it to be both sanctuary and challenge, a place that demands humility but rewards patience and courage. Over the years, I have seen storms rip through valleys. I have battled wildfires that turned the skies orange for days. And I have walked miles of trails in pitch black night to locate lost hikers crying faintly in the distance. I thought myself hardened, tested, and prepared for anything the woods might hold. That belief would eventually betray me, because what I encountered in the deep woods of Washington will haunt my dreams for as long as I draw breath. It began during a season that should have been ordinary. Early autumn had settled over the Cascades, painting the slopes with gold and red, the rivers running brisk with recent rains. My assignment was simple, a multi-day patrol into an area rarely visited by tourists and seldom touched by human presence at all, a stretch of forest wedged between ridges that most hikers bypassed because there were easier routes to scenic lakes. My duty was to check trail conditions, monitor wildlife movements, and ensure that recent reports of illegal camps had no basis. The kind of trip where the solitude becomes your only company, where the silence of trees pressing close is broken only by the measured rhythm of your own boots and the occasional call of a raven. From the first day, I felt something unfamiliar humming beneath the usual calm. At first I dismissed it as the unease that sometimes accompanies a long journey alone. Even seasoned rangers experience that faint prickle of nerves when they realize how far they are from the nearest road, the nearest voice, the nearest cell phone signal. But this was not the ordinary awareness of isolation. This was different, a low thrum in my bones as though the forest itself recognized me, not as caretaker or guest, but as intruder. I pushed on, determined not to let imagination cloud judgment. My training had taught me that fear can grow like mold in silence, spreading until every creak of branch becomes threat, every shadow a predator. I walked beneath stands of Douglas, fir so vast their branches meshed into a canopy that shut out much of the afternoon sun. I crossed streams where salmon flashed in quicksilver arcs. I noted fresh tracks of elk and the claw marks of black bear scratched high on the trunks. All of it was normal, recorded dutifully in my logbook. Yet every step seemed to echo louder than it should, and sometimes I found myself glancing behind, though I knew nothing followed. That night, I made camp on a small rise overlooking a narrow valley. The ground was damp from earlier rain, but I cleared a patch, set up my tent, and built a modest fire with dry wood scavenged under leaning logs. The flames gave comfort, pushing back the press of dark, and for a while I told myself the unease was fading. But as the night deepened, and the forest chorus shifted from daytime chatter to the nocturnal rhythm of insects and owls, the sensation returned with double force. It was not simply that I felt watched. It was that the watching felt deliberate, intelligent, as though unseen eyes measured not only my movements, but the fact of my being there at all. At some hour after midnight, I woke abruptly, heart racing, though I had heard no sound. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers, and the moon shone faint through a veil of clouds. My tent walls stirred with a faint breeze, yet the air inside was stifling, heavy with the scent of earth. I lay still, listening, and then I caught at a sound that did not belong. Somewhere down the slope, far enough that it could have been mistaken for trick of distance, came a cry. Not the high call of coyote, not the haunting whistle of owl, not even the scream of mountain lion. This was longer, broken, almost human, but warped, as though dragged out of a throat not made for words. I rose, unzipped the tent slowly, and crouched at the edge of the clearing. The forest stood in motionless ranks, black columns against darker night. The sound came again, a drawn-out wail that shifted midway into a low gurgle, then cut off with suddenness that left silence ringing. My instinct screamed at me to remain where I was, to retreat into canvas and wait for dawn. Yet training demanded vigilance, demanded that I understand what I faced, for if it was an injured hiker, then hesitation could mean death. I armed myself with flashlight and radio, though I knew the signal would not reach the outside world, and stepped cautiously into the trees. Each footfall seemed to sink deeper into soil than it should, and the beam of my light felt feeble, swallowed by the endless thickets. I moved slowly, marking landmarks with trained eye so I could find my way back. The cry did not repeat. Instead, as I descended toward the valley floor, the forest seemed to lean closer, branches knitting overhead until even the pale moon vanished. My breathing sounded harsh in my ears. I called out once, using my ranger's voice, clear and commanding. "This is Ranger Cross. If anyone needs assistance, call out." The only reply was the creak of wood. When I reached the stream at the bottom of the slope, I crouched to examine the bank. Mud held impressions, but not of boots. Not even of hooves or paws that I recognized. They were elongated, splayed like hands with too many fingers, pressed deep as though the weight behind them was immense. Water trickled through several, blurring edges, but enough remained to twist my stomach into knots. I knelt there far longer than reason allowed, trying to force logic onto what my eyes told me. No bear left such marks, no elk, no human. I withdrew only when I realized the night had grown too silent. Not merely hushed, but strangled as though the very air recoiled. Insects ceased, no owl hooted. Even the stream's babble seemed muted, smothered by the thickness of dark. My chest tightened with realization that I was not alone on that bank. Without meaning to, I lifted the light upward, and in that instant the beam caught something between the trunks. Two eyes, set too far apart, reflecting pale gold. They did not blink. They did not waver. They regarded me with an unbroken stare that pierced like spear through fog. I froze, every instinct in war with every teaching. Confront, retreat, hold ground. My training told me that most predators break off when faced with confidence, but there was no confidence in me then. Only raw dread. The eyes shifted slightly, and though no other shape became clear, I felt sure the thing stood upright, taller than any man, yet too thin for its height. My hand tightened on the flashlight, but a part of me knew that if the beam revealed the whole of it, I might lose my nerve entirely. Then, just as sudden as they had appeared, the eyes vanished. No rustle, no crunch of departure, only absence, leaving me trembling by the water's edge. I stumbled back up the slope, half running, not caring about silence now. When I reached camp, I found the fire dead out, though I knew I had left embers alive. I sealed myself into the tent, clutching knife and light, and did not close my eyes until dawn bled gray through fabric. The morning should have offered relief, yet it brought only deeper unease. Around the perimeter of my camp, impressed into soil damp with dew, were marks identical to those at the stream, hand-like, too many digits, circling as though the thing had walked round and round while I huddled unaware inside thin nylon walls. I could have turned back then. Perhaps I should have, but pride and duty are shackles of their own, and I told myself daylight would reveal rational answers. I convinced myself that footprints can mislead, that fear magnifies shadows, and so, instead of retreating, I pressed deeper into the wild, toward the heart of forest, where even maps rendered little more than contour lines. What followed across the next days stripped away every certainty I had about the natural world. What I saw, what I heard, what I felt pressing against the fragile shell of human comprehension. Those memories will haunt me forever. And this is only the beginning. I broke camp with deliberate hands and told myself the circle of prints was a trick of bad sleep and wet ground. Denial is a tool as useful as any knife, at least until it fails you. I cleaned the pot until it squeaked, folded the tent tight to keep my fingers busy, and set a bearing toward the interior valley, where the map showed a finger of land pinched by 2 ridgelines. The old survey notes called it Basin 3. No trail ran through it, just dotted lines for drainages, a few contour hooks like scratch marks, and the blank space that always looks calm on paper and never is in person. Fog hung low enough that it kept catching on my hat brim and sliding off in small beads. The air smelled of wet cedar and that particular cold, green scent ferns give off when they've been steeped all night. I moved softly, not because I cared about spooking anything, but because the hush felt asked of me, the way a chapel asks you to lower your voice without ever posting a sign. Sword ferns brushed my thighs. Nurse logs big as canoes lay furred with moss, collapsing into the soil they had once stood above. Every so often a Pacific wren stitched 3 bright notes through the understory, and I took those as permission to keep walking. When I stopped, water dripped from the canopy with a patient metronome. When I went on, branches tapped my shoulders like an usher, moving me toward a seat I hadn't chosen. I took comfort in small labors. I cleared a slim alder that had fallen across a game path, logged the GPS, snapped a photo for a maintenance request no one would ever see. I noted black bear scat, filled with red skins from the sallow berries, a paw print smudged by last night's rain. All of it could live inside the book of the world I knew. Then the stream forked and deepened, and the remains of an old bridge leaned out of the water. 2 cedar uprights black with age and soot. When I palmed one, pitch smeared my glove and flashed a smoke smell that made no sense if the charring came from some decades-old fire. The uprights didn't lean by gravity. Vines and twined fibers pulled them toward each other, high overhead, knotted into a crude rib cage. It looked like a lesson in anatomy taught by someone who had only ever seen bones through a fogged window. The prints reappeared on the gravel bar below the uprights. I squatted and placed my hand next to one, where a wide palm on a big man might be 9 inches. These were near 13, splayed in a way that put too many digits into the earth. The stride between impressions would have set a hip at the height of my chest. I stood up and let the stream soak my boots to numb my ankles, because adding one more straightforward discomfort was easier than inhaling the shape of the thing that had made those tracks. A mile on, the valley tightened and an old logging road ghosted the slope, flat shelf, alder crowding, coils of rusted cable half swallowed by humps of grass. I followed it because it gave a line to trace with my body, and men do better with thread in a labyrinth. The road ended at a landing, a scraped circle half reclaimed by saplings. In the center, someone had piled driftwood into a cone and lashed it with thin lengths of bark. Feathers, raven, jay, and something long and dun I could not place, hung from the lashings. If it was a ritual, it was built by hands that understood both patience and weather. If it was a joke, it had no punchline. My radio hissed. I unclipped it with an oversized relief and pressed the talk button. Static held on a high whine, and then I heard my name, but not in my voice. Cross, it said. The word repeated, same breath at the same place, like a cassette's warbling loop. Cross. Cross, cross. The display showed no receiving channel. I rolled the squelch back and forth. The hiss didn't change. I tapped the casing against my thigh, because sometimes irrational acts jolt irrational problems. The radio went quiet as a stone in a pocket. Cloud lowered until the ridges were erased and drizzle set in. the kind that never splashes but soaks everything by steady argument. After an hour, my jacket gave up. Cold threaded my sleeves and rib cage, and I welcomed it the way you welcome a stern supervisor, blunt rule, clear consequences. Then the woods shifted from the familiar to that wrong, kind of curious. Cedar grew at angles that made sense, only if a storm had ripped root balls out and flung trunks back. But there were no pits where the roots should have torn free. Hemlock and cedar braided into one another, not grafted by chance, but fused in clean, pale seams like healed bone. I ducked under an arch 2 trunks had grown to form and felt, with the sudden conviction I reserved for the obvious and the dangerous, that I had walked through a door someone had meant me to find much later than I did. I stopped early, not because I was tired, but because I wanted fire and fabric between me and the dark, however illusory their safety. I set the tent on a knoll of cedar duff and ringed a small flame with stones slick, as if they'd lived in streams. Jerky and a handful of nuts made a dinner more functional than pleasant. I left the radio off. The quiet tucked itself around me like a weighted blanket that could smother as easily as comfort. Sleep came and went in pockets. I dreamed the bridge's rib cage flexed and let a river run between its bones. I woke to drizzle at least 3 times. The 4th time I woke not to sound but to color, a thin green that seeped through the tent walls as if the fabric had been dipped in seawater. Dawn in these woods is gray or salmon pink. This was neither. Outside, the trees were lit from within, not full on lanterns. Thin channels ran up the bark, glowing like sap that had learned to keep moonlight. Where 2 trunks leaned into each other, filaments arsed between them, fine as spider silk and humming just at the edge of hearing. Bioluminescent organisms don't surprise a ranger. Ghost fungus glows on logs in Australia. Some algae make shorelines shimmer, but these were Douglas, fir, and cedar, and the light lived in them, not on them. When I tilted my head, the canopy flexed in a slow rhythm, tips lifting and settling, as if the crowns had taken a breath together. The sound it made, if sound is the word, was the memory of wind rather than wind itself. The green thinned and drained away like dye rinsed from cloth. Dark came back honest and heavy. I packed with numb hands and left without breakfast. For an hour I walked hard, only to circle into the same small meadow ringed with oxalis. I knew it by the alder with a lightning scar shaped like a human rib. I took out my compass, set a bearing in the opposite direction, and marched with the urgent stupidity that breeds mistakes. The meadow returned. The 3rd time my throat brought up a curse so loud, it sounded like another person was standing beside me. I put the compass back and knelt to look at the meadow floor, as if it could tell me how it lied. A sliver of obsidian turned up between my fingers from the duff. Too shiny, too sharp, not from here. I dropped it. The hair along my forearms rose as if the meadow had exhaled on me. Near midday, the trees drew back and the ground unrolled into a long bench of bare stone slicked with lichen. Water braided into silver threads across it. Tracks cut the wet lichen in lines too clean to be chance. Against whatever wisdom I had left, I followed them. The lines led to a seam where the stone split in a strip just wide enough to admit a body turned sideways. I squeezed through into a space that could be called a chamber if you were generous and had little else to call it. The ceiling arched like the inside of a rib cage again, and in the floor someone had laid a perfect circle of fist-sized stones. They were warm, not the warmth of sun, stored heat, which is diffuse and generous, but coin heat small, precise, as if each stone remembered a hand. In the middle of the ring, the floor went dark and pitted like old bone. I stood there too long, distracted by geometry and the pity you feel for a human effort left to the damp. Pressure built in my face, behind my eyes and along my sinus ridge, the way the air changes before a storm. When I turned back to the seam, stone had slid into it with the noiseless certainty of a lid finding a box. I put both palms on it and felt the give of muscle rather than rock, a resistance that pushed back without moving. I wanted to keep the circle whole out of courtesy for someone else's work, but survival outranks manners. I stepped over the ring and felt the air lift, not breeze, not draft, but a letting go, like heavy doors separating inches. When I tried the seam again, the stone yielded and light in a thin bar swung across the floor. I left by it with the absurd urge to apologize. Past that, I stopped pretending this patrol was normal. I moved fast, and the forest moved out of my way with that unnerving cooperation the wild sometimes gives when it wants you anywhere but where you were. Late light filtered, and with it the sound of a river not babbling, but talking in a steady low sentence. The slope turned to clay, and let me slide to the bank on both heels. The water ran hawk, feather gray and strong enough to wrinkle distance. Directly across, the opposite bank rose not as soil, but as a wall, uprights driven side by side for 30 yards, braced with a lattice of crosspieces, gaps set small enough to slow anything with legs. Where the wall faced upstream, it narrowed into a V like a ship's prow, and back of that, the lattice opened into a throat, leading to a pool so dark I could not see bottom. I have seen beaver feats that look like engineering projects, and men build foolish structures in places nothing should be built. This was neither. This was a trap with a mouth big enough to drink a tree. The mud below me wore the hand prints again, a palimpsest overlaying overlay, until the clay looked calmed by a giant. I placed my own palm inside one and felt, in that useless place in the chest that can go tight and hot all at once, how small I was. My radio turned itself on inside my pack. The volume wheel rasped along the canvas pocket and rolled, white noise unspooled, and then settled into a voice I knew too well. It was me 2 years ago, during a search for a boy who had been found only as a first name on a poster and a pair of shoes in a culvert. The recording dispatch kept for debriefings now bled into this present, thin with compression and threadbare from being played too often. We found tracks heading toward the creek. He's not alone. Silence followed, same length, same weight, like the past had exhaled into the mouth of my current day. I switched bands until numbers on the display were nonsense to the region. The voice kept speaking the exact same 3 sentences and kept not helping. I left the wall because I did not want to learn what it ate, and because once you understand a thing's food, you have to measure yourself against it. The timber away from the river offered thorns and devil's club, and the clean honesty of physical pain. By last light the fog came down again, and rain came with it. So I nested a small fire in a cradle of limbs on the lee side of a blown snag and worked it along with patience. Heat found me in pieces. I boiled water and salted it like a man seasoning himself back together. Then the world went quiet. Not the common hush of snow or the pause between gusts. This was a switch thrown. The rain still fell but made no sound on nylon. The fire curled bright but did not crackle. When I touched the pot, it sang at my finger, thin and pure. The silence was not absence. It was pressure. Something was pacing the edge of light. The steps came without rhythm, as if the walker hadn't learned cadence. A scrape and a long pause. Another scrape that ended in a wet drag my teeth could feel. I stood with the knife, because a blade doesn't make you safe, it makes you pay attention. I lifted the flashlight and stepped beyond the fire. The beam took a breath and then found a plane to hold. A face looked back, if face is the right word for a mask put together by a mind that had read about faces, but never seen one close. 2 eyes sat too far apart under plates like old antler polished by river. A split where a nose would be showed cords behind it that pulled open and shut with each breath. A line of wet along the edge of the plates turned to a spill of droplets when it moved, and the droplets hung like beads for a half second before falling. It braced one hand on a tree. The hand's heel fit the trunk like the tree had been grown for it, fingers fanning to 8 with a small ninth, nested near the wrist like a dew claw. At the end of each, a flattened pad darker than the rest pressed. The bark beneath had taken a polish. I understood without wanting to that this was not its first study of firelight. We regarded each other. My mind, sliding away from the hole, caught on strange details. A scar on the left plate, a thin white rope of tissue that disappeared under the edge near the eye. On the right plate, grooves cut in clean parallel. Not weathering, not accident. Deliberate marks made by something with a fine edge. Notches, counting. It stepped back and the pads peeled off the bark with a sound like gum lifting from a tabletop. It left the circle of light and sound returned all at once. Rain ticking, fire talking. Some barred owl far off asking who cooks for you. And I loved that bird for sounding ordinary. I did not sleep until Grade pried the black open. I made coffee hard enough to make my eyes water and drank it like an apology to my nerves. With the map spread on my knee, I drew a line that no committee would approve and no supervisor would praise straight for the ridge by the shortest path. In storms and terror both, elevation is a form of honesty. The climb burned calves and rinsed my chest with cold air that felt like medicine. Halfway up, fog thinned into strands and slid back into the basin like a herd of gray animals. I came to a shoulder and crossed a stand of silver snags where lightning had cleaned the bark away and left trunks like spears. At the far side, a post stood hammered into soil so hard I had to lean full weight to shift it. Someone had cut it square at the top and carved a single deep notch, clean-edged, recent. 20 feet away, another post, 2 notches, a third, 4 notches. I walked the perimeter of a rough circle the size of a small house and counted posts and marks. 1 through 14 on one side, then 13 on the other. 27 in all. I knew that number. I had carried it the way you carry grit in a boot, and pretend you don't. Plenty of rationalities to excuse it, and none that remove it. 27 missing persons across the cluster of counties around these woods in the last decade, found as names on flyers, as weather, soft photographs taped to gas station doors, as prayers said into microphones in gymnasiums, but not found as bodies. People do foolish things in wild places. People vanish in mountains with no help from nightmares, and still the Tali lived here where lightning had once walked, carved into wood that would outlast a dozen storms. I said no, out loud, to the snags in the fog and the thing that leaned on trunks to watch me. The trees gave me nothing back, and I didn't deserve anything anyway. Speaking the decision out loud rewired me enough to move. I took photographs. I recorded a note in my field log with time and coordinates. Then I pushed for the spine of the ridge until I could sit it like a saddle and see the basin fall away in hemlock shag on one side, and on the other, a valley I knew by its river's bright elbow and a pale strip of sedge meadow. Civilization lay in that direction. I followed the narrow back north to a rock knob bare enough to offer clean sky for a radio try. The first 5 calls fell into static, small teeth chewing. The 6th carried far enough to catch. 7, Bravo Cross, this is dispatch, do you copy? The voice threaded the wind like a line thrown with perfect aim. My throat closed and opened, and I put the calm back on my voice the way you press a bandage over a wound. Dispatch Cross, I copy. On a ridge above Basin 3, bearing north-northeast to Meadow Fork. I meant to say a helicopter, a line of rangers, a flood of protocol. What I said was, I need you to record the next part exactly. I meant to tell them about the wall in the river, and the ring of stones, and a hand with 9 digits and marks on its face. I meant to say 20, 7 into a system that would have to write it down. The radio filled with the thin keen of a child, and then it snapped to silence so hard my ears rang. I called again. The frequency stayed empty. Below me, the basin moved, not branches swaying, a pattern that repeated, then repeated, like a drummer who knew only 2 measures and was determined to pound them until the forest rewrote the song around it. The feeling along my spine was not fear now. It was the cold point of attention sharpened to a needle. I turned north and moved, not because I thought I could outrun anything, but because the line between witness and hunted had thinned to a thread, and distance is one of the few tools that keeps threads from snapping. The ridge swayed under my boots as if the mountain breathed, and, for a blinking second, I felt something larger than the weather turn its face toward me. The world, old and patient, seemed to say without a voice, "We are not finished with you yet." I pressed on along the ridge, with the steady rhythm of a man who knows that if he falters, the whole of his will might collapse. Rocks shifted under my boots, sometimes breaking loose and tumbling into the valley below with hollow clatters that seemed too loud in the quiet. Every sound echoed longer than it should, as though the stone itself were reluctant to release it. The fog thinned in patches, but never enough to give me more than a glimpse at what lay beyond. Slopes dropping into endless tree crowns, ravines carved by unseen rivers, and a sweep of wilderness so vast it felt like I was trespassing on a world untouched by human claim. The feeling that I had crossed some boundary into a domain not meant for men would not leave me, no matter how tightly I clung to training or reason. By midday the sun broke through for a brief, brittle span. I used it to recalibrate my bearings, taking out map and compass with trembling hands. The forest below the ridge seemed to ripple, waves moving across it without wind. I told myself it was the trick of light playing on layers of foliage, but I could not look too long without my chest tightening as though my body feared recognition of something my mind refused to name. My goal was clear: reach the Meadow Fork Valley, push through to the ranger outpost a dozen miles north. I had made that distance before in worse weather, but this time the miles seemed to stretch, doubling behind me, so that when I looked back, the ground appeared longer than I had walked. It was as if the landscape itself resented my progress and sought to erase it. When I descended into the tree line again, the air shifted, warmer, thicker, damp with a musk that clung to my nostrils. The scent was not rot nor fresh growth, but something between, like the breath of composting leaves mixed with iron. My ears picked up faint clicking sounds, irregular at first, then in pairs, then in rapid bursts like teeth chattering. The noise traveled ahead and behind, a chorus that moved as I moved. Once a twig snapped distinctly to my right, and when I swung the beam of my flashlight that way, it caught only trunks pressed close. But the trunks bore marks, fresh gashes cut into bark in long vertical streaks, as if something had dragged hand, like digits down their length in passing. Sap blood pale from them, still wet enough to glisten. The streaks were at the height of my chest, then higher, until some rose beyond reach of even the tallest man. That night I made camp reluctantly in a shallow clearing, where the undergrowth gave way to bare earth. My body demanded rest, but every part of me balked at the thought of sleeping exposed. I built no fire, fearing the light would draw more of those watching eyes. I ate dry rations in silence, chewing until the crumbs formed a paste I swallowed with difficulty. I forced myself to write in my log, though my words grew jagged and terse. Day 3, I recorded. Unexplained prints, structures, noises, possible ritual sites. Feeling of pursuit intensifying. My handwriting shook so much I could hardly recognize it as mine. I set the log aside and lay flat with my knife near my hand, eyes open to the canopy. At some hour between midnight and dawn, when the body craves most to collapse, I heard footsteps. They circled slowly around the clearing, dragging now and then as though something long brushed against the ground. I held my breath until my chest burned. The steps passed, faded, and then began again on the opposite side, as if mocking the thin courage I had left. Dawn found me gray and hollow. The circle of ground around my camp bore new marks, impressions in the soil, shaped like palms splayed wide. Too many fingers. Some prints overlapped my own boot tracks, almost as though deliberately placed there. I left the clearing in haste, half running at times, though every ranger instinct shouted that running wastes strength. The forest grew denser, branches clawing at my jacket, moss muffling each footfall. Hours passed in a haze of exertion until I broke out onto a dry wash strewn with granite boulders. Here, finally, the sun fell clean, lighting every surface. Relief surged through me, absurd in its strength. I drank deeply from my canteen, splashed water across my face, and for a fleeting instant believed I had left the worst behind. That illusion broke when I saw movement atop one of the boulders. A figure crouched there, long-limbed, its outline fractured by shadow. At first glance it looked like a man, hunched with arms braced against knees. But the arms were too long, reaching nearly to the stone itself, and the head turned farther than a human's neck allows, following me with that same gold-flecked stare I had seen by the stream. My hand went to the flashlight, though daylight rendered it useless. The figure rose in a fluid, deliberate motion, standing taller than any man I'd known, and its outline shimmered faintly as though the air itself tried to conceal it. Then, in a blink, it was gone, leaving only the empty stone and my ragged breathing. I crossed the wash in a stumbling hurry, refusing to look back. The valley narrowed again into trees, and with it returned the silence, the stifling, strangled kind that swallowed even the sound of my own steps. I tested it once, clapping my hands. The echo did not return. The sound vanished at the edge of my palms as though the air consumed it. Panic welled sharp in my gut. I began speaking aloud, anything to anchor myself, my name, my ranger ID, the date, the description of the terrain. The words cut short, thin and brittle, as if spoken underwater. I thought of radios of dispatch, of voices repeating names on lost person bulletins. The thought tightened my throat until I nearly wept. By afternoon, I reached the edge of Meadow Fork. The valley spread below, meadows stretching pale green under a lid of mist. For the first time in days, I saw a structure, the outpost cabin, a small rectangle of roofline where timber gave way to grass. Relief flooded me so fast it nearly dropped me to my knees. I hurried down the slope, boots sliding on loose soil, stumbling more than walking. The cabin door stood ajar, swaying faintly on its hinges. I called out before entering. Ranger Cross reporting. Anyone here? My voice sounded feeble in the empty space. Inside, the cabin smelled of mildew and dessous. Dust filmed the table, and the radio equipment on the shelf was dead, its power light unlit. A bedroll lay unrolled in the corner, damp and mold stained as though no one had touched it for years. But the logbook on the table was recent. Its last entry bore yesterday's date, written in a hand too similar to my own, arrived. Circled again last night. Cannot leave. I recoiled as though burned. The words blurred before my eyes, but I knew every stroke of the pen belonged to me. My heart battered my ribs in terror. I slammed the logbook shut and staggered outside, gasping air thick as syrup. The meadow around the cabin lay hushed, grass unmoving despite the faint breeze that touched my face. The stillness pressed until I could not tell if the world beyond the meadow still existed. I wanted desperately to flee, yet every direction looked the same, as though the meadow stretched endless no matter where I turned. As night approached, the grass began to move, not with wind, but with rhythm. Blades bent in patterns, swaying side to side as though trodden by invisible feet. Circles formed, then broke, then formed again, weaving wider each time. My body refused to obey the command to run. I stood rooted, watching as the circles closed toward the cabin like ripples spreading inward. Within the grass, I glimpsed shapes rising. Thin, tall, jointed wrong, eyes gleaming gold. They walked without sound, without weight, yet their presence pressed against me harder than stone. I stumbled backward into the cabin and barred the door, though I knew wood meant nothing. Through the cracks I saw them gather, dozens perhaps, circling, swaying with the grass. One drew closer, placing a palm against the wall. Fingers spread across half the planks, nails digging faint furrows into the wood. The cabin shuddered as though the touch itself carried weight beyond its form. The night lasted an eternity. The beings circled without pause, their eyes shining in and out of cracks. Sometimes I heard my own name spoken in my voice, sometimes in others, sometimes in dozens at once, all whispering, "Cross," until the word lost meaning. At some hour I blacked out, not from sleep but from sheer collapse of mind. When dawn came, pale and merciful, the meadow stood empty again. Grass bent flat in rings testified to their presence, spirals pressed into earth that no wind could have shaped. I left the cabin without looking back. The logbook remained inside, its words mocking me, and I refused to touch it again. My only thought was to escape, to find a road, a trail, any sign of human presence. I stumbled through the meadow into forest, branches whipping my face, thorns clawing my arms. I ran until my lungs burned, until the forest blurred into a smear of green and black. When at last I collapsed to my knees, gasping, I looked up to find myself standing before the same stream I had crossed days before, the same rib, cage uprights looming above. The circle had closed. I was back where I had begun. The uprights loomed before me as if they had been waiting, black ribs knotted overhead into that crude cage. I dropped to the stream bank, pressing my palms into the mud, because part of me still clung to the hope that the world had not bent, that I had only misjudged direction, doubled back by mistake. My compass needle spun in lazy circles, pointing nowhere. The stream itself seemed to curl around my boots and then retreat, as if water could think, as if it recognized me and chose to refuse me passage. I rose shaking, rage trying to burn through fear. I shouted into the canopy, words torn from my throat. "Nuff. I know this forest! You don't own it!" My voice sounded small, strangled. The woods swallowed it whole without echo, and the silence that followed pressed heavier than my outburst. I pushed upriver along the bank, moving fast, mud splashing up my legs. The smell of iron thickened. The prints returned, deep in the silt, hand-shaped and endless. Some faced forward, some sideways, some backward, as though whatever left them did not care which way its body turned. A madness rose in me, a frantic urge to obliterate the marks. I stamped one under my boot, grinding until the shape blurred. When I lifted my foot, the print was still there, clear as before, as if the ground itself refused to be altered. Night fell with a swiftness that made no sense for the season. One moment dusk, the next a crushing blackness. I lit my headlamp though the battery was failing. The beam struck trees that leaned toward me, branches knotted like arms reaching. I heard the clicks again, louder now, answering each other from both sides of the river. The pace grew faster, building into a clattering rhythm like bone castanets. I gripped my knife until my knuckles screamed. Then came the voices. My own, first repeating fragments from old patrol logs. Then others' names I had read on missing person flyers, whispered as though the forest had stored them. Ali, Samantha, Cole. The voices circled, never overlapping, each distinct, each too close. I stumbled into a clearing where firelight flickered without source. The flame hovered in midair, a spiral that wound higher with each heartbeat until it towered above me. In its glow, I saw shapes around the edges of the clearing. Dozens, maybe more, thin and too tall, with faces that flickered in and out of coherence, never steady. Some wore plates of bone across their features. Some had hollows where eyes should be. One bent low, head cocked, and I recognized the scar etched into its left plate. The same one I had seen watching me from the tree line. It had been following all along, marking me, waiting. The fire spiral bent toward me, heatless but suffocating. Whispers rose from it, a chorus of all the names at once, growing until the sound pressed into my skull like hands shoving. I dropped to my knees, palms clamped over my ears, but the voices lived inside bone. They told me to stay. They told me I had been counted. They told me 27 was not the end. I screamed back, though the words dissolved, my throat tearing raw. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was gone. I was back at the cabin. Its door gaped wide, logbook still on the table. My own handwriting filled every page now, not just one entry. Lines upon lines, paragraphs sprawling, all written in my hand but none remembered. Some described trails I had never walked, rivers I had never seen. Others listed names I knew only as missing, with details no search reports had ever uncovered. Each name ended the same way, circled. My stomach lurched. I staggered outside, bile rising. The meadow was no meadow now, but a vast hollow, grass laid flat into concentric rings, spiraling inward toward a pit I swore had not been there before. From its center rose a breath, hot and moist, like the exhale of something too large to see all at once. I backed away, my boots catching in bent grass. Around the rim of the hollow stood the figures, tall and still. They did not move. They did not need to. The rings themselves shifted, bending under invisible weight, tightening. I ran, though the circles seemed endless, meadow folding into itself with each stride. My lungs seared, my legs numbed. When I tripped and fell, the grass beneath me was damp with something thick. My hands came away streaked red. Blood, pooled in the grooves of the spirals, trickled toward the pit. I crawled until I found forest again. Trunks closed around me, roots rising like bars, canopy blotting even starlight. My headlamp failed then, bulb popping with a soft hiss. Darkness swallowed me whole. I pressed forward blind, feeling bark scrape my arms. I don't know how long I walked like that, bruised and stumbling, guided only by a pull I could not name. At last a faint glow appeared ahead, green, like before, bleeding through the trees. I reached it and found another circle of stonehole, larger than the first, each rock slick with something that pulsed faintly beneath the surface. In the center lay an object, my radio. I picked it up with shaking hands. The power light blinked, though the battery had long since died. Static hissed, then broke into a child's voice, thin and trembling. "Help me." The words looped, rising in pitch until they no longer resembled speech. I hurled the radio into the dark. It landed with a sound not of plastic on soil, but of flesh slapping wet ground. A moment later, something out there repeated the sound perfectly, mocking. Then came a long silence. I could feel them gathered, just beyond reach, waiting for me to take the next step. I turned in circles, desperate, and found myself facing the posts I had seen before on the ridge. The carved tally of 27. But now new notches had been added. I counted them by touch, fingers tracing raw grooves. 28, 29, 30. My knees buckled. I pressed my forehead to the post, wood damp against skin, and whispered to myself that I would not be the next mark. I would not. The forest disagreed. From the dark came the click of digits on bark. Hundreds of them, joined in rhythm until the night became a drum beat. It pressed against my chest, matched my heart, threatened to stop it altogether. I ran again. No sense of direction, only away. Trees thrashed past. My body tore on branches, blood-slicking sleeves. The drumbeat followed, faster, louder, closer, until I thought the very air would shatter. Then, sudden as a trap springing, the ground fell away. I plunged down a slope, tumbling through brush, crashing into rocks until I landed hard in shallow water. Pain flared bright, but above it came another realization: the river here was different. It ran true, loud, unbroken, not muffled by the silence that had followed me for days. Its current surged clean, tugging at me with force that felt real honest. I staggered to my feet, letting the water pull at my legs. The drumbeat faltered on the far bank, the clicks retreating. Whatever haunted the forest hesitated here. I waded deeper, chest heaving. For the first time since this began, hope sparked in me. That perhaps the river marked a boundary, that perhaps I could escape if I followed it. But the river had other plans. As I moved with it, the current thickened, slowing until it felt less like water and more like syrup. My legs dragged. I looked down and saw hands, those same two, many fingers, pressing from beneath the surface, clutching at my boots, my calves, dragging me deeper. The current was not current at all, but a living thing. I fought, thrashing, clawing for the far bank. My knife tore at water that was not water. I screamed until my throat shredded. Somehow I broke free, hauling myself onto the stones. I collapsed there, body shaking, lungs racked with sobs. When I raised my head, dawn bled across the treetops. The drumbeat had vanished. The silence, at least for that moment, had lifted. Birds called. A jay screeched. Normal sounds, sweet as salvation. I staggered upright, swearing I would follow the river wherever it led, swearing I would not look back again. And yet when I turned, my eyes betrayed me. Across the water, lined on the far bank, stood the figures. Dozens of them, motionless, their eyes gold in the dawn. And behind them, towering above the tree line, something vast stirred. A shape too immense to comprehend, ribs arching like mountains, head hidden in cloud. My knees weakened. The truth cut through me sharp as the cold air. This forest was not simply haunted. It was alive, and it had noticed me. I followed the river because it was the first thing in days that behaved like itself. Even when it thickened into that syrup, grabbed and tried to keep me. Even when hands pressed up from its skin, like things waking out of a dream, the water still moved downhill and made sense of gravity. And that was a gospel I could walk beside. I kept my boots on the stones just above the lick of current and matched my breath to its rush. Across the far bank they stood in their tidy line, close enough that I could see dew beating on the plates of their faces, far enough that the river's chatter drowned the clicks they made to speak to one another. When I tripped and went to a knee, they tilted in unison, as if a single attention had shifted angles. I stopped looking at them, because watching was an invitation to panic, and panic in the backcountry writes obituaries. The ridge to my left rose from the river like the flank of some enormous sleeping thing, its crown in fog. Every 100 yards or so the bank cut back, and I had to step into the water to get around a boulder or breach, and each time my legs remembered the drag and tried to sepal, I talked to my body in the same tone I used for skittish hikers in the field. Not calm. Calm is a fiction you invent for other people. But steady, practical. Left foot. Ref foot. Look 3 steps ahead. Stay low under the willow. Where the bank crumbles, angle toward the alder roots and use them like a ladder. When the voices came thin from the trees on the far side, Eli, Samantha, Cole, and the long list past that, I named features in response: undercut bank, old flood line, last year's debris. It did not make the voices stop. It made me real to myself. Near mid-morning the river bent around a shoulder of stone, and the world opened. A side valley shouldered into the main course here, and down that feeder a white seam stitched its way. Falls, not high, but busy and complicated. Water stepping itself down in shelves and lips. The spray lifted moss smell into the air, with a sweetness so clean it rang like metal. I dropped to a squat, and let my hands hang between my knees and listened to that sound until the tremble in my legs flattened out. Across from me, above a flat tongue of black rock, stood a structure I first mistook for blown timber until the lines resolved. Uprights again, but these carved square, interlaced with crosspieces tongue, and grooved tight as joinery in an old church, braced against the current with a stubbornness bordering on character. The opening formed a V pointing upstream, and either side of that V was netting. No, not netting, not fiber. The sinewed stuff of tendons, pale and tough, lashed into a mesh so fine it made the river look slow behind it. I smelled iron, and my mouth tasted like a penny. I did not need to be a genius to understand what the throat and the mesh made together. Fish ladders started somewhere in men's minds as this same idea. The difference was scale and hunger. Inside the throat lay a pool so dark it returned no shine, and I had the childish impulse to toss a stone in to prove a bottom existed, and the adult recognition that proof was not the point. Along the crosspieces hung things that had been in the world longer than a season. A rusted bear bell and a child's sneaker laced to itself. A ranger's shoulder patch with the edges chewed into a fringe. A photograph slipped into a crack and held there, by nothing but will. A boy of 8 or 9 with the kind of haircut parents give before school pictures, his hand raised at the moment of the shutter, like he had just discovered, or had just been told to show, that he had 5 fingers. I stood too long in a place where standing was a decision. The line of them on the far bank began to break into 5s and 3s, each group angling along the edge to keep pace with me as I cut downstream. Where the river narrowed to a chute, I saw a log jam make a rough bridge, and I knew from training that crossing the kind of log jam a river has made for itself will teach you humility, and crossing it because you're being watched will teach you a different thing entirely. Still, the choice of turn back or go across is one men have made since caves were the only roofs. I tapped the log with my boot, waited for the smallest rock to drop and the smallest piece of bark to lift, and started low, hands on slick wood, mind on the creek bed below, so I'd stop thinking about faces. Halfway, one of them stepped onto the near end of the jam. It did not test the wood like I had. It placed its hand, 8 fingers and the little dew nub near the wrist, flat on the great trunk and pressed, and the entire jam answered with a creak that lived up my forearms and into the hinge of my jaw. It glanced at me sideways, the way an elk will when it wants you to know it's thinking of charging, but not whether it's convinced. I took one hand off the log to fumble at my chest pocket. The flare was a stub, cylinder scuffed, cap bent out of round. Rangers carry them out of proportion to how often we need them. Light and noise can be the difference between story and eulogy. Don't, I said, to the flare, to the thing, to whatever watched us both through the skin of the world. The cap came free. The striker rasped and nothing caught. The second rasp gave me a spark the size of a flea. The third found a stubborn vein and bled a ragged, stubborn light. The white core spat and then established, hard and clean. I held it out the way I had been taught, angled down and away, because a flare is a liar about gentleness. The thing absorbed the light without blinking, and in the sick flare glare, I saw the notches carved across the right plate of its face were more numerous than I had thought, each groove cut with a care that told me it had learned edges the way men learn alphabets. It moved back, not in fear but precision. The way you step off a hot slate, you know, will still be hot tomorrow. Behind it, some of the others pulled away from the bank's lip, and one leaned long enough into the light that I finally saw the plates were not plates at all, but layers. Something like bone grown over something like cartilage grown like thick leaves. The flare ate itself in a fast white breath. When it guttered, The dark drank our little geometry and handed me back nothing. I shoved the dead stick in the river and crossed the rest of the jam with my chest pressed to wet bark and a refusal to look up. On the far bank, the path away from the water grew obvious if not merciful. The slope lifted in a version of a trail deer, pick through sword fern, bear push through salmonberry. Men pretend they are making choices, not just taking advantage of what the mountain allows. Climbing stole breath but gave distance, and distance turned the clicks back into suggestion. I kept the river's voice to my left and angled toward the fall line, where the trees began to thin. Open-grown Douglas, fur white in their crowns, and give light back to the ground, and I made for that promise like a thirsty man makes for a shaded porch. Another 50 yards, and the green under my feet changed from wet to gray, and then crunchy as glass. I put a hand out and found bark that came off in sheets, and a branch that ringed at the slightest touch. I had walked into a burned scar, old enough that snag tops were blunted and the grass between black trunks had rooted, young enough that the memory of fire still lived in the soil in a way the nose recognizes as certainty. Relief took me sideways. Fire is terrible, but it is honest, and a ridge that has burned is a ridge that offers a line of sight. I could see the sky fully for the first time in too many days. I could see a power corridor cut in the near distance, not live. The poles long since down, but still straight where straightness had been laid across contour. I could see a cluster of posts someone had sunk along the ridge, and I knew them before I put my hands on them. The counts. The number I had turned into a pocket stone, turning it over until it had gone smooth 27. They had grown in my absence. 30 posts, then 31. The notches so fresh under my fingertips the edges were almost tacky. The 32nd stood newly set, wobble in the earth, not yet packed hard. "No notch! Not me!" I said. And again, because saying a thing twice makes the mouth believe, and once you can make your own mouth believe, you have a start. Not me. Wind came. Nothing like a storm. Just a moving mass of air that turned the burned snags into a choir of hollow reeds. Between notes, I heard the small talk under the wind, different from the clicks, more like the way ravens gossip, something like amusement, something like deliberation. My radio, inert so long I had quit insulting it with hope, woke in my pack and spoke with dispatch's voice. The relief that surged up made me stupid. I let it have me, and I had the talk button pressed before any part of me could object. "Dispatch, 7, Bravo Cross," I said. "Ridge above Meadow Fork burn. Possible cut to old line. Request." The sound that cut me off wasn't the child's voice this time. It was my own, giving a location nowhere near here. A road name out of a completely different district. Then another voice, my captain's, calm and clipped, the way she could be when things were sliding sideways. "Cross, stay put. Helicopter 5 minutes out." Then the sound of rotors, perfect to a degree that made me flinch. No chop changes with terrain, no thrum stutter, nothing to tell the ear there was mass being hauled through air. I let the button go. The chopper noise passed overhead, precise, as if tracing a circle cut into the sky itself, and then moved off to my right and did not fade with distance so much as shut off like a light. "If you can imitate them," I said, not sure who I was talking to, "you can imitate us. That's not a win for you. It just means you moved closer to the wrong god." I didn't expect a reply, and I didn't get one. The posts waited with their one blank still offered. The burn ridge slid away north toward the corridor cut, and beyond that lay country like a man had drawn it. Section lines and spur roads, and that little half-mile stretch where someone had once planned a campground and then hadn't found the budget. I put my hand on each post as I passed, the way you touch a friend's arm who doesn't know how to accept help and doesn't want to be left alone, and counted backwards out loud like my grandfather had taught me when he wanted a scared boy to stop hyperventilating. 31, 30, 29. By 23 the wind shifted and brought me the smell of creosote, faint but there, the ghost of railroad ties. The corridor itself was grief and blessing. Where the poles had come down long ago, insulators glittered in grass, half-swallowed porcelain moons. Where brush had tried to take the cut back, someone, human, had walked it within the year and knocked it down with a blade. Human. The word made me dizzy, like I'd stood too fast. I wanted to shout in the direction of that effort and tell them they had done a kindness, and I owed them a beer. Instead, I walked, because men who talk too much in the woods learn things the woods didn't mean to teach. The line led me to a road so rutted it would have broken an axle, but so unequivocally made that my body took it as permission to shake. I let myself sit in the gravel and cry the way a man will when tension has turned his bones into cables and someone has finally cut them. When the pressure eased, I got up, wiped my face, and started down. The sun found a hole in the thin cloud and put a square of light on the hillside ahead. On the near side of that light stood a figure in a ranger's jacket. For a second, relief carved me hollow. I raised my hand and called out my name and a "hey" that cracked like a teenager's. The figure raised a hand in return. It moved forward with the easy economy of someone who had spent most of their adult life walking uneven ground. And in that little movement I realized two things that slapped me sober. The jacket was mine. The notches across the right plate of the face had notched one more line since I had last counted them. I did not run at it. I did not stand and pretend not to be a man who could be cornered. I stepped off the road into the ditch and walked the ditch like it was its own road, the way animals do when they like to use the thing men built without being caught by the rules baked into it. The figure matched me stride for stride on the crown of the road, and when it came abreast it tipped its head, almost a courtesy, and laid its hand on one of the old poles stacked beside the cut. There were marks in the creosote where pads had polished it. When it leaned away, it left an impression as neat as a signature. I told it, because sometimes names are a tool, and sometimes they are a net. You're not getting me with mine. I won't wear my own jacket to my own funeral. I did not expect the words to be anything but a balm to my own fear. It made a sound I had not heard from them before, something small and high and cracked that I realized, 2 seconds later than I wanted to, was laughter. The ditch led to a culvert. On the far side the road bent into trees, and beyond those trees I could make out the wedge of the maintenance yard's roof, brown and shingled the way roofs are when a budget doesn't match a best practice. Trucks, fuel, a refrigerator where food sits without needing to be hung in a tree at night, a door that locks, and right there, absurd in its decency, a flag whipping itself around a short pole as the wind remembered how to gust. The only problem between me and those ordinary things was distance, and the thing that liked distance in the way cats like threshold lines. I crossed the culvert. Gravel pop. A jay shouted the kind of insult that jays get away with. On the far side I took the middle of the road. I don't know why. Maybe because I needed to stop acting like prey. Maybe because there is a kind of prayer you can only make when you give up on ritual and choose embarrassment. The figure kept its pace and then, without fanfare, let me pull ahead. When I glanced back, I couldn't help it. I saw that it had raised a hand, like a man shading his eyes to look up slope, and the others along the timber edge had done the same. They weren't watching me anymore. Their faces had tipped to the ridge behind the yard. A sound reached me, the unmistakable laboring cough of an engine that hasn't been warmed in a week. I laughed, which tasted like blood because somewhere along the way I had bitten the inside of my cheek to ribbons. The chain link gate stood shut. The padlock wore rust like a scab. I put both hands on the mesh and shook until it sang. Movement inside, a figure in a hooded sweatshirt, then the hood pushed back and a human face. Human not because it matched mine, but because it didn't. Pimples tracked one cheek, eyebrows wild, mouth set in a line that said he'd been told this is your job and wasn't convinced. He came to the gate and stopped with a professionalism that made me want to hug him. "You okay, man?" he asked. My voice took a moment to find its shape. When it did, it was smaller than I had imagined, but serviceable. "Ranger Cross," I said. "I need a phone and a vehicle, and for you to keep your eyes down if you hear your name." He blinked. "Okay," he said, doubt in the vowels. He lifted the chain, wrestled the lock, and I had the sudden terror that the old iron would hold just to prove it could. It gave, grudgingly. He swung the gate. I stepped through and did not turn to check the tree line. He swung it shut at once, the way a man will if someone has taught him that the first thing you do when a dog comes in at night is get the door between you and the dark. "Phone's in the office," he said. "Truck'll take a jump, but I can—" "Hey, you're bleeding." "I'll get to it," I said. And he put his hands up in that innocent surrender that says, "Okay." I asked the thing I feel required to ask for the sake of decency, and now I will move on. In the office, the fluorescent tube buzzed like a fly. The clock on the wall was 5 minutes behind my watch, which felt like an insult given the elasticity time had offered me lately. But it was such a human kind of insult I could have kissed the clock. I picked up the phone, and the tone that came was a real tone, live and bored. I dialed dispatch. I gave my name and the yard's designation and spoke the words the world expects of a ranger. "Need medical," I said. "No major bleeding. No fractures I can find. Just—" I couldn't say haunted, and not because it sounded childish. I couldn't say haunted because it was too small. Just situational exposure. Extended duration. Potential PTS, copy, dispatch said. And the relief that voice kept ordinary buttered the space behind my ribs so well I could breathe deeper than I had since the first night. Units en route. Hold there. You are not to return to field without command authorization. Copy, I said. She started to ask the next question and stopped midway through the first word. A silence that was not static but surprise. "Ranger Cross," she said, voice climbing a step. "I have you already logged on Channel 5. You're on a ridge near Basin 3. You just requested we record your statement exactly." "I didn't," I said, and then, before she could frame that into a protocol note, "I mean I did. But I didn't now. I did then. This is now." A beep. "Then, cool, we'll keep both." I hung up because the landline started speaking back to me in my own voice, and I did not need to add that to the list of things to give me dreams. The kid with the hood was outside with cables clamped to a truck that had seen better administrations. He looked up when I stepped into air and gave me the once over a young man gives an older one when he wants to know how much he has to carry. "You gonna sit?" he said. Not a question. "I'm gonna sit," I agreed. The seat stunk of dust and spilled coffee. It was the most beautiful smell in the world. He turned the key. The truck coughed and then decided to trust us. He drove the half-mile to the blacktop like a man taking a cake out of a house full of cats. At the end of the lane, a stop sign bent. Beyond that, the honest rectangle of pavement that led, by degrees and with placid indifference to my personal saga, toward town. On the way, I did the things a ranger does when moving from field to office, after a thing the office won't want to name. I checked my limbs for ticks of the obvious sort. I kept my shoulders loose so I could still turn my head without making a scene. I thought of the logbooks and the rings and the tally posts, and the words that formed were not report words but liturgy. I kept them behind my teeth. At the clinic, men and women with the efficient gentleness of people who have touched every version of panic touched mine. Someone taped butterfly closures over the tear at my hairline. Someone else asked me if I wanted to talk to a chaplain and accepted. Not yet. Like it was a fine answer. A detective came and sat in a chair too small for his shoulders and slid a recorder across the table like he was handing me a cup of water and not a responsibility. "Anything you can tell us," he said, and left everything else unsaid on the table between us. I gave him the edited version, true in bones if not in meat. The wall, the river, the structures, the sounds. I did not say faces, but I described the hands. I gave him coordinates where coordinates existed and bearings where they did not. He wrote it all down with a pen that clicked the same tempo as the posts in the wind. "Search?" he asked, when the paper had a tide line of ink halfway down. "You'll be tempted," I said. "You'll think it's disrespect not to, but you're not going to find what you think you're looking for. And you're going to give it a few more names to say. The math changes when you go in there." He looked at me with the hard eye of a man who has told too many parents there was nothing to bring home. "We still have to try," he said, and because decency is work in this world, I nodded and said I understood in the same tone. And the lie we both told together lived between us like an agreement to keep the town running. Weeks later, because time returned to behaving, I drove up alone to a pullout high enough to see a piece of the basin as a knitted green bowl and a piece of the ridge as a line of black supposed to be trees. I did not cross the gate. I sat on the hood with a thermos and watched weather think about forming. When I got back in, the passenger seat creaked with a weight that wasn't there. I didn't look, because good things can be scared away and bad things can be made braver by being seen. At home, when the house settled at 3 in the morning, I woke thinking I heard the small resiny peel of pads on wood. I lay flat and counted backwards. 31, 30, 29. Once, a week after that, I found a ring of river stones on my doorstep, each warm in the center like coins that had been held too long. I swept them into a bucket and tipped them back into the creek and felt, when the water closed over them, as if I had put something back where it belonged. You might want me to end with a rule, because rules are what we make when we don't understand a thing and want to live anyway. I have a few. Don't say yes when your own voice comes from the wrong direction. Don't walk toward a light that bleaches the bark, rather than lays on it. Don't make a circle in a place that is already nothing but circles. If you come to a ridge cut in notches, count them once and leave without giving the wood your hand. If you end up in Meadow Fork and the meadow decides it's a mouth, keep to water that remembers gravel and gravity, not hands. But I'm not giving you comfort. I can't. I'm writing this from a desk that has a pane of glass to its right, and the glass holds a view of cedars that have been here longer than the building. Sometimes, when the dishwasher knocks a pipe and the house hums in that particular pitch, the cedar tips all lean once the same way, as if something unseeable the size of a township has turned its head. Sometimes the radio on the counter says my name like I left it a debt. And last night, while I wrote down the names of those I could still bring myself to write, Eli, Samantha, Cole, and the rows that follow, the pen left a groove without ink, neat as a carved notch. And when I looked up, the shadow in the window had its head tipped like a listener deciding if the story had finally reached the part it was waiting for. I am a trained forest ranger. I know how to map a drainage and read a sky, and talk a lost man out of the kind of grief that makes him walk in circles until his soles come off. I also know that somewhere out there, no, not out there, just under the thin skin of everything that looks like out there, something counts. It likes our edges. It likes the sound we make when we think we are alone and speak our names as if they were small. It likes when we carve tali in wood because we tell it with our patient hands that we understand the game. I will not give it my notch, not while I am awake to keep it. But when I sleep, it walks the perimeter of what I have left, dragging its pads lightly on the boards to mark where my little light fence begins and ends. I lie on my back and let breath leave slow and careful and speak to myself, steady and practical. Left foot, right foot. Look 3 steps ahead. Do not step into the circle, even if the circle is only a thought. And when the river rises in the dream, and the hands press up under it, I hold very still and wait for the current to remember itself. Because even in its worst moods, the water in this country knows downhill, and how to carry a man who asks for nothing but the chance to be set down on clean gravel again. If you go, which you shouldn't, which you will, take a name tied to your wrist with plain string, not your own. The name of a tree, the name of a river you miss. Tie it tight enough to leave an impression. When you hear your voice call from the wrong place, name the tree, name the river. Tell the world what it is before it tells you what you are. If you make it back, and you'll think the trick was yours. Walk the long way home, and do not count the telephone poles. When a child waves and shows you 5 fingers, wave back with your hand closed. And if, one day, you are cleaning out a drawer, and you find a patch with your department's crest, and the edges frayed into fringe, as if teeth have worried it for years, put it back. Close the drawer. Go outside. Stand where the light lies honest across the yard. Say nothing. Wait. Somewhere a ridge will breathe. Somewhere something will cock its head amused. It will think of rivers and of names. It will remember that it has 30, 1, 30, 2 if I am careless, and numbers are the only saints in this church that do not forgipple. I am telling you this because the telling is the one thing I have that does not belong to the trees. I am telling you because I wanted there to be a conclusion, and there isn't one. Only the long unraveling of a thread stretched from a stream with too many hands to a cabin with a logbook that writes itself, and to a town where a flag on a short pole will wrap itself around metal whenever the wind makes a mouth of the ridge. I will go back. Of course I will. Not because courage is a virtue and not because I am paid to. Because a man who has been counted cannot sleep through the arithmetic. Because somewhere out there a boy stood with his palm open to show 5, and then went missing from the picture that declared him real. Because names set into trees are a poor gravestone, and if there is a way to carve anything different into the wood of this place, I mean to find it. Until then, when night falls with a swiftness that makes no sense for the season, I light the smallest flare I have and hold it angled down and away. The white core eats itself, and then the dark says give, and I do. I give it the part of the story that can be told and keep the rest in the part of me that has learned to be quiet. Because quiet is not surrender here. It's respect, and respect is the only rope I have found that will hold when the rest of the world turns to water. If you hear a laugh from the timber, and it sounds like yours, do not argue with it. That is a sermon designed for someone else. Walk to the river. Put your palm on a stone. Wait for the cold to steady. Count backwards until the numbers turn into the sound the water makes when it chooses to be exactly what it is, which is the only honest sound the forest offers a man it has noticed and spared.